I will dispense with introductions, except to say, and I hope both speakers will allow me to introduce both of them as our colleagues. First, David Wills, and then Jacques Ranciere.
Okay. If I were speaking French, my title might be Plus de sang, more blood or no more blood. That is because blood has already been identified, perhaps even copyrighted, as a political concept in the context of the project that brings us together here. This discussion, therefore, cannot but defer to and repeat the single blood as political concept already developed by Gil Anidjar in 2011, and which now forms the basis of a key chapter of his monumental book of the same name, Blood, A Critique of Christianity, 2014. In that discussion, Anidjar constructs and deconstructs blood as concept, as political, and as singular. First, and I quote, "Blood did not become a concept, though Hegel did propose in the Phenomenology of Spirit that the absolute concept may well be called the universal blood," end of quote. Second, blood is not, strictly speaking, political, yet blood operates, or shall we say circulates, at the outer extremes of politics, end of quote. And third, quote, "Blood makes and marks difference, an allegedly universal difference inscribed between bloods," in the plural, end of quote. So let me begin by saying there will have been blood. I'll use that tense, in the first place, to lift or sublate the pure literality of sanguine flux into the abstraction of conceptual possibility, such as is our task here. Blood, after all, repeating Anidjar, will never have been a concept. It seems to fit Hegel's description of the thing as object of sense certainty. Quoting Hegel now, "The thing is, and it is, merely because it is. This pure being, or this simple immediacy, constitutes its truth," end of quote. Blood is something that we know when we see it, something we know to mean what we see it to mean. Blood. There it is. There you have it. And again, mixing my blood with Anidjar's, but differently, blood doesn't only circulate at the outer extremes of politics. As I have discussed elsewhere, and in fact, as was evoked this morning by Michael, there is no concept of the political in Schmidt's sense without blood. It is Schmidt's very concept of the political. The concept of the political relies on that of an enemy, which in turn requires, quote, "the ever-present possibility of combat," end of quote, an extreme enmity that necessitates what Schmidt calls physical killing. War is a condition of possibility for the concept of the enemy, which is a condition of possibility for the concept of the political, and that is a war fought precisely along a clearly defined front. To understand such a war, we might refer not to Schmidt, whose, quote, "existential negation of the enemy remains somewhat euphemistic, at least in the concept of the political," and instead to Ernst Junger, who describes First World War combat in his Storm of Steel as a beckoning, quote, "carnival of carnage," end of quote, a political scene determined in its essence by, quote, "the overpowering desire to kill," end of quote, where soldiers act as if under the spell, quote, "spell of primeval instincts," end of quote. Junger relies on the pure literality of blood to impose transcendent clarity over rhetorical imprecision. Quoting again, "It is not till blood has flowed that the mist gives way in his soul. It is only then that he becomes once more a soldier of today," end of quote. Junger's war journal emphasizes what Schmidt's theory of a political dependent on combat requires: the blood without which there is no combat worthy of the name. For that reason, it is blood that defines the front, that defines the combat. that defines the enemy, that defines the political. Blood is the front at its most animate, and trench warfare is, quote, the bloodiest, wildest, and most brutal of all warfare, end of quote, from Storm of Steel once again. And continuing, of all the nerve-wracking moments of war, none is so formidable as the meeting of two stormtroop leaders between the narrow walls of the trench. There is no retreat and no mercy then. Blood sounds in the shrill cry that is wrung like a nightmare from the breast, end of quote. Now, judging by his comments on motorized and later aerial warfare, Schmidt seemed to have an inkling of the problems for his concept and logic of the political that obtained once there was no longer that front dug in the Flanders mud. Once a national or political territory was no longer a homogeneous spatial extension circumscribed by a frontier, a line along which an opposing force operating at the outer limit of another homogeneous spatial extension would be drawn up. Once there occurred the sort of tele-technological extension of the front that has now brought us all the way to intercontinental drone warfare. We might also suppose, given his justification of Hitler's purges of public enemies, that Schmidt would approve of the extrajudicial assassination of, quote, imminent threats that is the pearl in the crown of President Obama's foreign policy scintillating brilliance, the universal adoption of what Eyal Weizmann calls, so aptly in another context, thanatotactics. But my sense is that even and especially in the case of extrajudicial assassination, Schmidt would have wanted and expected blood, long knives, mano a mano wounding, and have been as offended by the remove from the ennobling heat of combat afforded present-day Baco Lounger-bound Hellfire missile dispensers as their fellow soldiers often appear to be, if one reads the blogs. But it is on the blood of more judicial applications of the death penalty that I wish to concentrate for the remaining time today. On that blood, on its flux, and on its time, even its tense. For there will have been blood, in the sense that it can henceforth be assumed there will be no more. There was blood, perhaps flowing like the oil in P.T. Anderson's film, or flowing like red in a painting by Matisse or a film by Godard. But according to the tense and temporality of the formulation, by the time we get to this moment, the moment in question, there will be no more blood. Blood will be over. After having been all over, it will all be over. Imagine that. No more blood. Blood no more. Imagine that if you have the time. It is tantamount perhaps to stating that there will be no more time, no more blood, tantamount to no more time. For there will have been time, flowing like blood or oil, and there will have been an interruption of time like no other, a particularly programmed interruption, an interruption of time called the death penalty. For the condemned one, time will have run out. For the executed one, the end of time will have been announced in the form of death. No more time. He or she will have lived, will have had time, perhaps will have given or been given time up to the moment when he or she has no more. She will have had time until the point at which she has no more time. He will have had blood flowing until the moment when his blood flows no more. There will also have been cruelty, which takes time. Cruelty, the likes of which seems unimaginable, except that the likes of it is eminently capable of being repeated at any moment. Recent and current history testifies to that. Cruelty, the likes of which is repeated or rehearsed for us in all its spectacular gore, by Foucault at the beginning of Discipline and Punish, in the recounting of the orgiastic bloodbath that was the execution of Robert-François Damiens, pincered, drawn, and quartered in 1757 for the flesh wound he inflicted on Louis XV, an execution whose botching was attributed to lack of practice, an unfamiliar protocol, we might say today. The procedure not having been used for well over a century since the previous regicide, Ravaillac's assassination of Henri IV in 1610. There will have been that cruelty, and more. But unlike blood, and perhaps time, cruelty will not be no more. There will have been and always will be cruelty when it comes to punishment, and indeed when it comes to the death penalty. Derrida analyzes at length in the first volume of his death penalty seminars the various economizing ruses of cruelty exposed by Nietzsche, including the discovery of a surplus value of pain applicable for its own sake. And he, that's Derrida, returns consistently to the question in the second year of the seminar, concluding that, quote, cruelty perhaps has no contrary and no end, no term or opposable term, end of quote. And again, cruelty, quote, cruelty is constitutively excessive. One is never a little or moderately cruel. There is no measure or moderation to cruelty, end of quote. We were reminded about a year ago by the US Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, the Russell-Bucknew case in Missouri, that there is, quote, a constitutionally permissible amount of pain and suffering inherent in all executions, end of quote. For we are now witnessing a certain rekindling of the debate over what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. As a function of having the punishment fit the crime, the permissible application of hardship is no doubt the everyday business of jurisprudence and the judicial system. So much so that there was a 15-year sentence imposed in 1910 for defrauding the government in the famous, what is now a famous case in discussion of death penalty cases, Weems versus United States, where precisely an Eighth Amendment defense was mounted. The punishment of 15 years was supposedly cruel and unusual. But in the case of the death penalty, it becomes the specific question of permissible physical pain and suffering, and hence a question of a different type of cruelty. A disproportionately long prison sentence, or even solitary confinement and all the other perversions of incarceration allowed in the US is one thing. And of course, I'm avoiding having to include here the paradigm case of all this on the extreme edge of judiciality and constitutionality, that is Guantanamo Bay. A lengthy prison sentence is one thing, but assessing permissible physical pain is another. And of course, I'm avoiding here the paradigm case for pain also on the extreme edge of judiciality and constitutionality, namely torture, where according to John Yoo, Deputy Assistant Attorney General in March 2003, pain has to be sufficient to cause, quote, death, organ failure, or serious impairment of body functions to constitute torture. In any case, it is now possible that the Supreme Court will be or will have been required by the lethal injection debacle once more to go down the path of explicitly measuring physical pain and suffering in order to determine what form of cruelty the Constitution permits. To determine the difference between what is constitutively excessive in Derrida's terms and what is constitutionally permissible according to the Founding Fathers. The court will not have done so, not in the same terms at least, since Furman v. Georgia in 1972, when Justice Thurgood Marshall in particular, but also Justice Brennan laid out in no uncertain terms their objections to capital punishment on principle and on precisely those grounds. Or since Gregg v. Georgia in 1976, when the doctrine that any death sentence was cruel was rejected just as clearly by citing precisely the 1910 Weems case, the 15 years for fraud. For according to that case, cruelty of pain may be present in punishment. Presuming the debate reaches the Supreme Court, we might expect to hear rehearsals of Brennan's Furman v. Georgia contention that, quote, death is today an unusually severe punishment, unusual in its pain, in its finality, in its enormity. No other existing punishment is comparable to death in terms of physical and mental suffering. It appears that there is no method available that guarantees an immediate and painless death, end of quote. We might expect to hear that reinforced by reference to the opinion of the 4 dissenting justices in Louisiana ex rel. Francis versus Raceweber, where Willie Francis petitioned the court after his electrocution was botched in 1946 due to mechanical failure, claiming that he shouldn't be required to live through it again. The dissenting minority, because the petition was declined, held that, quote, this is the minority speaking, the dissenting minority that was therefore ineffectual, quote, the all-important consideration that the execution shall be so instantaneous and substantially painless that the punishment shall be reduced as nearly as possible to no more than death itself, no more than that, pardon me, of death itself. That opinion was, however, countered by the majority, denying the petition, who maintained that, quote, the cruelty against which the Constitution protects a convicted man, the cruelty against which the Constitution protects a convicted man is cruelty inherent in the method of punishment, not the necessary suffering involved in any method employed to extinguish life humanely, end of quote. On one side, unless a death is so substantially painless that it is only death, it becomes cruel, while on the other, there is no cruelty in the necessary suffering that is death. Cruelty appears somewhere between substantial painlessness and necessary suffering. I'd like to imagine sometime in the future, once there will have been the death penalty in the US, and once it is no more, or rather, I'd like to imagine the time it will or would have taken, less for the current death penalty to be abolished than for the casuistry of calculating the permissible quantity of pain and suffering to appear as the absurdity or obscenity that it is. Something similar to determining how to define a slave as a fraction of a whole person. As you may remember, 3/5 in 1787, 30 years after Damiens was divided into 4 quarters. Perhaps by 2057 or 2087, we'll be able to smile at the manifestly ludicrous seriousness with which the justices will now determine how much it has to hurt too much as you die. How much more a cocktail of maidalozam to render you unconsciousness, vecuronium bromide to stop your breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart, how much more that hurts than, say, a single dose of pentobarbital. Or how long a condemned person has to writhe on the gurney to demonstrate that their constitution cannot withstand permissible constitutional pain. 11 minutes, like Scott Dorn Carpenter in Oklahoma in 1997. 24 minutes, like Raymond Landry in Texas in 1988. 25 minutes, like Dennis McGuire in Ohio in 2014. 34 minutes, like Angel Diaz in Florida in 2006, or the record, 43 minutes, Clayton D. Lockett in Oklahoma in 2014 again. Perhaps by 2057 or 2087, those good faith Supreme Court deliberations will seem as offensively quaint as Kant's lucid sense, evoked by Derrida, of how to apply the jus talionis, the law of the talion, in the cases of rape, pederasty, and bestiality. Kant's response, castration quite clearly in the first 2 cases, permanent expulsion from civil society in the third, obviously. So there will have been time there will have been blood, but there will never have been cruelty to the extent that there will never not be cruelty. The French call what will have happened a future anterior. In English, we say rather future perfect. In French, it is a future in the past that is nevertheless anterior to, precedes another explicit or implied event, either in the future or the past, and it is used in a greater diversity of constructions than in English. Thus, not only as in English, by the time the DNA evidence becomes available, you will have already been executed, or the Supreme Court will have made its decision by this time tomorrow, but also, and here I'll include parenthetically transliterations of the French usages, as soon as the drugs have been found in English, but as soon as the drugs will have been found in French on the black market, the execution can proceed. Or, the public defender missed that important detail as he fell asleep in English or will have fallen asleep in French. Or, in 2005, in Roper v. Simmons, Scalia was scandalized, will have been scandalized in French, by the idea that American jurisprudence might be inflected by international opinion or conventions when it comes to executing juveniles. But I'm not here to give a grammar lesson, less still a physiology lesson, less still a judicial or a moral lesson, although it is perhaps around the question of blood that everything gets confounded. If I have insisted on the future perfect, it is to emphasize a difference between what is done, perfected, achieved in time, and what still seeks to determine the anteriority or posteriority of the thing. How in this verbal tense, this tense verbal standoff, there is a type of intersection between future and past such that what appeared to be happening within the perspective of its own future gets preempted by the past. For the death penalty, more than any other sentence, trades on a relation between the suspended and the definite. By the time the axe falls or the switch is thrown, there will have been an end to deliberation, but before that, some logic of judicial process means, indeed requires, that the future continue to be an option. For that reason, what we call a summary execution is considered to be extrajudicial, except that it could probably be argued that even in such a case, the logic still applies, even as it is short-circuited. Clearly, though, the judicial process involves prosecuting and defending attorneys alike, indeed a whole institutional machine that evokes one version or another of finiteness or finitude, as does the law in its principle, and not just the law that decrees capital punishment. That is the sense of the verdict as arrest, or arrêt in French, the stopping of deliberation. The accused or convicted one always risks running out of time, running out of appeals, and then ultimately he does. The future perfect then becomes the simple perfect, simple past. No more time, past time. No more blood, past blood. Is there a future for blood? Derrida asks in the second to last question of his 2-year seminar series. Is the death penalty still possible, still able to be conceived and practiced as such, once it is no longer a function of the bloody sacrifice from which, in its onto-theological roots, it appears, according to Derrida, to derive? And that derivation, which links the death penalty to sacrifice, may be not only onto-theological, Derrida suggests, but indeed anthropo-homo-hematological, evoking an essential or originary relation between blood and human culture in general that goes beyond Gil and Nija's sense, a relation whose current form is perhaps coming to an end. For we appear to be witnessing, quote from Derrida, a transformation of our experience, etc., in relation to blood in all of its registers, culture, religion, but also medicine, genetics. And when it came to the question of the death penalty and execution, we also noticed something like the disappearance of blood, of the effusion of blood, of the shedding of blood. End of quote. As Derrida consistently reminded us throughout his first volume, the one that is available in translation and in French, cruelty signifies, etymologically at least, blood itself, from the Latin cruor. And the progressive humanization or anesthetization of the death penalty has as one of its elements an occultation of that blood. But the relation between blood and cruelty is not a simple correlation, leading me to posit the operation of another factor within it. I'll come to that in a second. Among the four paradigmatic cases that Derrida evokes, Socrates, Christ, Al-Hallaj, and Joan of Arc, it is only Al-Hallaj who dies a really bloody death by some combination of torture, crucifixion, and dismemberment, reminiscent of Ravaillac and Damiens. In contrast to Socrates' hemlock, Joan of Arc's burning, and Jesus' crucifixion. Blood is already occulted even in Christ's case, even if the subsequent iconography has often wallowed in it. For you may remember, if your memory is better than Mel Gibson's, that although Jesus was whipped and crowned with thorns, the Gospel of John, the sole gospel to record the fact, states that it was only after he died that a soldier pierced his side so that out flowed blood and water. So one might suppose that more primitive technologies of execution, but also contemporary forms, play on a judicious application of pain that works precisely by controlling blood flow, which also involves a play on visibility and, in complicated ways, a play on spectacle. Blood loss is economized in order to prolong the torture in the cases of flaying and crucifixion, and is, as it were, bypassed in the case of hanging. Blood is purified with elemental fire in the case of burning, and infected in order to confound death with anesthesia in cases from Socrates' hemlock to lethal injection. Of course, blood does not have to be visibly shed in order for death to be induced, as such methods of execution already show, but also the stake, poisoning, strangulation, and electrocution. And indeed, if keeping blood invisible is the aim of contemporary anesthetized Western death penalties, it is also the ideal of the most sophisticated forms of torture, both physical and psychological, arguably thereby the most cruel methods of punishment. But the hypothesis now that I wish to advance in conclusion is that the relation between blood and cruelty is articulated not so much through visibility as through temporality. The temporal signification of blood is something that gets occluded in proportion with cruelty, in the tendency toward anesthetization and toward the invisibility of blood. But in fact, what makes blood cruel is its temporal technologization. Once it becomes a question of flow as duration or temporality. Time is the fulcrum where blood meets cruelty beyond any etymology, and where the pure naturality of blood reveals its mechanicity. If blood provides the homohematological nexus that Derrida points to, if, quoting Derrida, a history of the treatment of blood, a history of the shedding of blood, of the blood one sees flow, of the blood one lets flow, of the blood one causes to flow, of the blood that one does or doesn't staunch, the history of an immunity to be saved, to be kept safe and sound, if that merges with the history of what is called man, end of quote, it is to my mind because blood as the history of what is called man is precisely the time of the human, the temporal measure of life, specifically human or mammalian life, but that life technologized. That is what makes it such a crucial manner for the death penalty, or conversely, what makes the death penalty such a crucial matter in order to understand the human and time, because capital punishment is about the interruption of life as that blood flow of time. From that perspective, one can note a certain return of blood, perhaps, in response to the lethal injection crisis in the US, where proposals by lawmakers in Wyoming, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Utah, and the latter two states now have relevant statutes on the books, where those states have touted the firing squad, last used in Utah in 2010, touted as the most humane method of execution. What execution is from guillotine in 1789 to Utahns in 2015 strive for is a form of capital punishment that will stop time and life instantaneously, stopping blood and preempting cruelty, something as close as possible to the immediate and painless death that Justice Brennan believed impossible, but which Justice Burton and Francis hoped could be, quoting again, quote, so instantaneous and substantially painless that the punishment would be reduced as nearly as possible to no more than that of death itself, end of quote. The death penalty might therefore be understood to have always negotiated beyond what is supposed with a more or less technologized and temporalized blood. For while it reinforces on the one hand an anthropohematology that defines the human by means of blood and a certain vulnerability of blood, as well as by fault and the necessity of sacrificial expiation, on the other hand, it engineers and continues to refine the most explicitly brutal confrontations between animate and inanimate, between the human body and rope, iron, or pharmaceutical prostheses. But beyond that, by choosing the instant of death, by negotiating everywhere along a conception of the by negotiating everywhere along a conception of the instant that is, at the end, nothing but the instant of death itself, presuming one can find that, and at the other, the time it takes to make death really felt the way pain and penalty would have it felt. In doing that, the death penalty reveals the mechanics in the hydraulics. It ascribes to blood, to life, and to life-blood, a temporality and a duration that makes it life-death blood, interrupted by the finitude we all know, are condemned to, and die of, measured against the death some are simply condemned to, for the death penalty makes such futures perfectly past, until it is itself, will be, or will have been absolutely past, as if before that, it will never have been. Thank you.
Well, contributing to a lexicon of political concepts normally implies that you take for granted that politics exists as a well-defined sphere of human activity, so that one should choose either a concept belonging to that sphere or a concept showing its foundations, be they ontological, theological, or other. My own contention, however, is that this existence per se is dubious, but the homogeneity of the multifarious practices, rules, and institutions subsumed under the notions of politics, policy, or the political is questionable. In disagreement, I propose to conceive of politics as an alteration of a normal order of things, of a normal distribution of places and functions, identities and capacities. And I try to show that politics is an activity that reframes the mode of visibility of the common, the configuration of the space and the form of temporality within which some affairs are seen as common affairs, and subjects are given the capacity of dealing with those affairs. This also means that politics is a conflictual process within which the very meaning of the words is at issue. So I'm not interested in proposing a concept explaining what politics is. Instead, I'm interested in examining words whose meaning is at issue in situations when the very identification of politics itself is at issue. From that point of view, words that are worth examining to rethink politics might be words that have two characteristics. First, they are not specific to politics, but they designate alterations in the visibility of what is normally thought to be the stage of the political. Second, they link the question of the common with matters of space, of framing of time and space. This is precisely the case with occupation. Occupation is not a notion that normally belongs to the political corpus. Until the very last year, apparently, it seemed to concern politics only in a side way, as something belonging to either the military sphere, as in the occupation of Palestine, or the social sphere, as in those strikes that were named in the United States sit-down strikes, but in France, grève avec occupation. It is only in the recent movements that the word popped up on what is normally thought to be the political stage. And it popped up on this stage as something precisely disturbing it, as an ephemeral upsurge of inefficient aspirations deprived of any political program for both our governments and our leftist strategists, or as real democracy against the lie of representative politics for those who took part in those movements. We can add that this aspect of exceptionality was marked by the privilege given in English to the verb occupy, while in France we speak of occupation, so of making occupation a substantive. Well, this first point is strictly connected with the second one. Occupation deals with matters of space and time. It deals with them in a way that shows a tension between two users of time and space. You may occupy a place in a normal way as owners or tenants, but the notion takes on its full meaning when you take possession of a space which is not yours, or when you use it in a way which is not its normal use. For instance, if you put your tent on a square, which is made for urban circulation and not for politics and for spending a night. That matter of space becomes still more explicit if, as was the case in the occupation of Gezi Park in Istanbul, the conflict is precisely about the use of a space. Second, occupation deals with time, but it deals with it also in an apparently contradictory way. On the one hand, the occupation of a space appears to be something provisional. A military occupation is not supposed to be an annexation, and the occupation of a square is an interruption of the normal use of this place, which is not destined to last forever. But, on the other hand, an occupation, in the English language notably, is the activity to which you devote your time, which means not only a job, but a normal use of time. The idea of occupation implies the idea of a regular activity taking place within a regular order of time and a regular distribution of activities. In that sense, an Occupy movement might be defined as a movement interrupting the normal order of social occupations, as was condensed in the slogan of one protesters in New York. The slogan was, "Lost my job, found an occupation." My contention is that this interruption and the very tension between two meanings and two connotations of the notion of occupation may help us think how politics is connected or disconnected, connected to or disconnected from a certain order of time and distribution of spaces. To test this hypothesis, I will approach the notion from two angles. First, I will deal with the forms of spatialization and temporalization of politics at issue in the recent Occupy movements. Then, I will make a short travel through the history of the notion in order to discern what kind of original knot we may find between politics, time, and space. So, and how this original knot may be inherent in the notion of occupation. Then I shall go back to the present to think about how it embodies this concept of, or possible concept of occupation, but also at the same time how the present shows us a shift in the meaning of the notion of occupation. So I will first examine some aspects of the use of the notions of occupying and occupation in the recent movements, and notably in Occupy Wall Street. But I was struck that most of the narratives about Occupy Wall Street make the story start with a decision to change the sense of a political demonstration by changing its use of the space. Protesting in the street of the city, of course, always entails that you use a space devoted to circulation as a metaphor of the public space. In normal protest, however, this metaphorical use is associated with the idea of movement. Protesters take to the streets and go over them to both make their demands visible and embody the dynamic of their protest. This is a diversion from the normal use of the streets, but this diversion is still in keeping with this normal use, moving, which also means that it remains faithful to a certain distribution of the roles and of the places between the workers who circulate their demands and the sitting authorities to whom those demands are addressed. A new deviation from that normal diversion thus consisted in the decision, so the story goes, to break with that material and symbolical distribution of the roles. It was a decision to stay instead of moving, and discuss among themselves instead of shouting their demand to the authorities. This involves two forms of structuration of the space, the assembly and the tent. The assembly, of course, is a canonical form of identification between the material configuration of a space and the symbolical configuration of a community. It is par excellence the common place or the place of the common. So making an assembly instead of marching meant reconfiguring the common, setting aside the existing configuration of the relations between the power and the protesters, by transforming the latter into a sort of constituent assembly, deciding to ignore the existing authorities and discuss instead about the very sense of politics or the very essence of a political community. So making an assembly in that sense meant beginning politics again, reinventing a public space out of the very disposition of bodies on a ground and the very mode of their speech. This is why in the Occupy movements, the circular structure of the assembly was completed by another spatial feature, but was important at that moment, horizontality. The new assembly was told to be an assembly wherein all individuals are sitting on the common ground at the same level, without presidents, leaders, or professional orators. My point is not about the validity of the representation of the political community that animated the Occupy movements. It's about its significance. From this point of view, what was significant is the much questionable idea of consensus that prevailed in those assemblies was not the fact that the decision should be unanimous, which obviously had always been the case in the authoritarian practices of so-called democratic centralism. But it was the fact that it could be blocked by the disagreement of one person. Horizontality thus worked as a complement and correction of the circle, a way to constitute a public space wherein the collective implementation of equality was based on the direct manifestation of the equal capacity of each speaking being. It worked as the affirmation of an anti-hierarchical subversion, questioning the distance between individual capacity and collective power, and by the same token, the boundaries separating the time of political life and the time of private and everyday life. This is how the assembly connects with the tent. The tent is a multifarious symbol combining militant, if not military occupation, friendly youth party, and deviation from a mainstream form of life. Also, the tent is both a symbol of a provisional settlement and a symbol of global contestation of the normal way of dwelling in society. Occupation then seems to connect a reconfiguration of the political space with a wider reconfiguration of the way in which life in general is occupied, in which its time is divided into various spheres of activity requiring appropriate individual capacities. This connection was also made perceptible from the strange extensions that the verb occupy, underwent during the Occupy Wall Street movement, notably, And those extensions made this term occupy kind of signifier of a conversion to another way of inhabiting the word. This is how came occupy language, occupy imagination, occupy love, and eventually occupy everything, which seemed to mean change your way of dealing with everything and with all existing relationships. The Occupy movement have thus revealed how the existence or inexistence of politics is embodied in forms of spatialization and temporalization, and in uses of space and time. The distribution of spaces and time appears as a mode of visibility of the distribution of the common, the public, and the private. So they have made it appear as a conflict between two distributions of the sensible. I think we can move more forward in the understanding of this conflict by briefly tracing the history of the word occupation and of the tension between its meanings. If we look at dictionaries, we cannot but be struck by the difficulty they have finding the right order of derivation for the various meanings of occupy and occupation. What is the exact relation between the exceptional military occupation of a foreign country and the usual job or way of life of an individual? Between the fact that you reside in a place and the fact that your time or your mind is occupied in this or that way. Between the act of occupying and the fact of occupation. In the Oxford Dictionary, the first definition for occupy is reside in, whereas the first definition for occupation is what occupies one, a means of passing one time. It's not so easy to go from this past time to the act of taking possession of a place by military force. We can ask the French language from which the English word was borrowed to clear up the ambiguity. But we soon meet new problems. The thesaurus of French language first defines the verb occuper as fill a space and derives from this the fact of holding a job as well as that of taking over a territory. Then it moves to a second meaning, which is absorb, fill, meaning by this the fact that something is a concern in which one is absorbed. As for occupation, it is defined first as the action of occupying a space, then as a fact to devote one's time to something, the action to which one devotes one's time. Then the thesaurus says, strangely, by metonymy, the thing to which one devotes one's time. Well, this metonymy is obviously a very strange derivation, since the historical examples collected by the same thesaurus show exactly the contrary. The first meaning of the word in the history of French language is the thing which is your concern, the thing to which you devote your activity. A meaning which, as it's confirmed by Warburg's dictionary, existed 2 or 3 centuries before the military sense of the word. It seems then that the occupation as the thing to which you devote your time is a category much prior to and possibly independent from any idea of seizing hold of. Well, we can try to test this hypothesis by carrying on our way back. As it turns out, we perceive a similar discordance in the Latin language from which the French word comes, while occupare clearly conveys the meaning of seizing hold or taking over. Occupation, in most of the occurrences, designates the thing to which the activity of a person is dedicated, or the concern occupying his mind. This relation between the activity of a person and the kind of concern occupying his or her mind can be made, I think, more explicit if we move to Greek and we look at a word whose root is different from occupatio, but whose use is quite close. This Greek word is epitedema. Epitedema, often used in the plural, epitedemata, the activities of the mind and the body, the concrete ways of being and doing, whose acquisition, according to Plato, is part of the education of the guardians of the city, along with that of the abstract sciences called mathemata. An epitedema, allow me to translate an occupation, means both the way in which an individual passes his time, the kind of activity that he exerts, but also the way in which he exercises his mind and his body to make them apt to the exercise of that activity. Which means that an occupation is not simply the fact of doing something, but the fact of doing it as the thing for which you are made. In fact, the substantive epitedema in Greek comes from the adjective epitedes, which means appropriate. And this adjective itself has a very curious formation. It is made of a preposition, epi, and the demonstrative tede. Strictly speaking, it means being epitedes means being made for that, or being for that. An occupation is a demonstration of appropriateness, the demonstration that you are made for the activity that you perform just as is it made for you. Such is the principle that rules Plato's Republic. This is how, for instance, the education of the guardians of the city first implies the selection of those whose nature is appropriate, epitedes, for that occupation, epitedema. On the opposite side, the exclusion of poetic mimesis is based on a principle that reads as follows: everybody should be occupied by one sole occupation. This is also why the artisans must stay all the time in their workshop and do only the job for which they have the appropriate capacity. And they have to do it all the time because Plato says work doesn't wait. The point is not about the number of hours required for doing the work or acquiring the skill for doing it. A capacity is more than a skill. It is a destination. And time is not a duration. It is a location. Plato's statement locates the artisans in the time of an eternal everyday, a time of immediate material needs opposed to the time of common affairs. The only way in which the shoemaker takes part in the common of the city is the private activity consisting in making shoes. Such is the principle of polis, the principle of a hierarchical distribution of the sensible. And occupation is a way of being in time and of being at the place where the rightness of your being there is endlessly demonstrated by the exercise of your activity. This demonstration for me might be the rough translation of the famous sentence by Hannah Arendt commenting on the diverse forms of the victa activa in the human condition, quote, each human activity points to its proper location in the world. Well, this matter of location makes it possible to substantiate my hypothesis, seeing in the recent Occupy movements opposing a form of occupation to another. Occupation, in fact, is a notion that can take on opposite meanings, which means that it points towards the conflicts of two distributions of the sensible. It points to the connection between activity and location that defines either the order of police as the fact of doing the activity suitable to your place, or the possibility of a political disruption as the use of a place in a way that disrupts the normal use of that place. The occupation of a place is a disruption of the distribution of the spheres of activity. This is something that you can also understand in relation to the distinctions made by Hannah Arendt to sustain her division of human activities. As is well known, she denounced the race of the social, which she thought was predicated on the confusion between the public and the private. Such a race for her was tantamount to a blurring of the specificity of the political. For my part, I argued that politics precisely happens when the normal distribution of roles between the private and the public is thrown into question, which means that the social is a privileged place for observing how politics happens. And it happens precisely as a dislocation of the activities or the disruption of the normal set of relations defining the time and space of an activity, along with the kind of capacity or the kind of virtue that it sets to work. Occupying and occupation popped up on the public stage with the occupation of the factories, which took on the character of a mass practice during the general strike of 1936 in France. From the point of view of those who dwell on the separation of the spheres, occupation then is just a weapon in a social struggle opposing the interests of the workers to those of their bosses. I took the exactly opposite view of it. This kind of strike was, in fact, the achievement of a long historical process through which matters of work and employment, which were supposed to be private or domestic affairs, were transformed into a public affair. This process entailed that its actors, the workers, distanced themselves from their occupation, from the way in which they were appropriate to their occupation. It entailed their transformation into participants in the construction of a common stage, which was built as common through the census itself, meaning not simply disagreement, but the disruption of an order of times and locations, the dismissal of a way of being in time and space, appropriate to one's job. The material occupation of the workplace then was the accomplishment of this process of disappropriatedness. The occupied factory was not simply the takeover of the space and of the machines of the enemy as an economic weapon in the struggle, nor was it simply the affirmation that that space and those machines belonged to the workers. It was a transformation of that space into a public space. But this becoming public did not happen in the Arendtian way, by separating the domain of public action and public excellence from the space of domestic life. On the contrary, it happened with the blurring in the role given to a space, that the fact that a place made for working became a place for living, for eating, sleeping, or organizing friendly parties. The process of occupation is not simply the takeover of a space. It is a takeover that changes the very use of this space in the distribution of social occupation. This is why the occupation of a workplace became part of a whole reconfiguration of a public space. A public space which is no more besides the spheres of domestic life, economic negotiation, etc., but a public space built by the very disruption of the distribution of spaces and capacities. Well, we know how important this idea of the occupied space became in the movement of the 60s, and notably with the occupation of the universities in several countries. The occupation of the Sorbonne in 1968 Paris claimed to transform an instrument of reproduction of the elites into its opposite, a forum open to everybody for discussion and for the invention of a non-hierarchical form of society. This occupation, however, entailed a split in the idea of occupation that was illustrated by one of the most famous episodes in Paris, May 68, when the occupants of the Sorbonne decided to join the workers occupying the emblematic Renault factory and found the gates closed. Two forms of occupation then were colliding, the students' forum and the workers' fortress. This tension can help us think of the specificity of the recent Occupy movement and possibly the shift in the idea of occupying, that they imply. Those movements are both the heirs of the workers' occupations and their antithesis. The new occupation takes up the principle of transforming a space, the function of a space. But this space is no more an inside space, a space defined in the distribution of economic and social activities. It is no more the inner space of work as the space of a concrete fight between capital and labor, for instance. It is the space outside, in front of the offices of the financial power which destroys jobs and relocates factories, or in the streets of the towns where the leaders of an invisible global power meet, or against the cranes and excavators that the state power send to change the destination of a park, or against an electoral process of reproduction of the ruling elite. As the locating power has increasingly become a power situated nowhere, that dislocates the inside places wherein the order of time and space, activities and capacity could be challenged. As it had become a power of dislocation of spaces, the place that remains to be occupied is the public space. That's the only public space that still lends itself to a multiplicity of various and possibly contrasting activities. The streets, destined to the circulation of the individuals and the commodities, but the busy persons cross and where the unemployed persons stay. The parks, that symbolize a common possession of a space whose use is indeterminate. Such places lend themselves to symbolize a common space opposed both to the economic dislocation of the common spaces of work and to the abstract representation of the common in the state buildings. The occupying process does not anymore take place inside buildings destined to specific activities as a subversion of that destination by its normal occupiers. It happens in this public space of the streets and parks, which is at the same time the space without specification where everybody walks, and the symbolic space of public demonstrations. And the occupying process is no more the fact of people that the capitalist process has gathered, and it is on the contrary the fact of people that this process has scattered into a multiplicity of forms of employment, unemployment, part-time employment, a multiplicity of connections and disconnection between the times and space of the job market, the times and space of education, or the time of space and art and many other spaces. This means that the occupying process, perhaps, is no more about transforming a given manner of being in a common in a place. It's about transforming separation into community. It's about creating a place for the common. In a sense, the assembly and the tent are the fragments of a lost totality, but also this loss accounts for the strong emphasis on the assembly as a form of being in common, and this aspiration to consensus that has so strongly struck and disturbed all those, including myself, for whom such forms of action are precisely understandable and valuable as forms of dissensus. It can be said, of course, that the consensus among the participants is one thing, the dissensual aspect of their practice with respect to the normal order of things is another thing. Nevertheless, it sounds for me as a division in the area of occupation, as if the desire for community or the desire for a new life exceeded the specific operation of conversion of a space, as if the desire for politics exceeded politics. Occupation, then, might definitely be the strange word that marks the paradoxical status of politics, the status of an activity which is always beside itself. Thank you.
My question, I hope, bridges the two talks, and I want to think about the question of the mortal, right? And think about the notion that original sin pronounces the death of all mortals, and then the question becomes whether the moving back the notion of cruelty to the pronouncement of the death sentence for the already mortal, where they become either submortal or somehow subhuman because they know the time, place, and methodology of their death from the pronouncement of the penalty. So I'm wondering, from that perspective, if we can think about an altered relationship with temporality, whether death arrives at the moment of execution or if death arrives at the moment of the pronouncement of execution. And then to think about this question of occupation by thinking of perhaps a preoccupation where the inmate who's been given the death penalty then is preoccupied with mortality, right? Is occupying the space of death all the way to the point of death. So I'm wondering about if we can relate the two things in that way.
Yeah, good question. For me, what's particularly interesting about the practice of the death penalty is the fact of how it plays with time, precisely. So your point that maybe one is already dead when the sentence is passed is a valid one in the sense that, especially in the way that the death penalty is practiced in the US, that passing of the verdict, right, the passing of the sentence, says nothing, it seems, in practice about the time of the execution, right? Says nothing about it in the sense that there are these extraordinary deferrals. There are people who are incarcerated for 25 years on death row and so on. So definitely, I think that my sense of how temporality operates both in an extremely compressed form, if you like, in the principle of execution, right? Here is the moment where we will end your life, right? That does not negate the expansions of time that take place, if you like, within that same structure, within that same operation. And so, you know, you can use the example that you've used about how one is treated as dead the moment one is relegated to death row, and one could say an awful lot, as you've suggested, about the humanity or subhumanity of that and so on. But it goes all the way to the fact of the lethal injection process itself, where precisely even there, at those very few moments that are supposed to be reduced as much as possible, right, to make it as short as possible, there is nevertheless a play between extended time and arrested time, between condensation of time or an exaction of a precise instant and an extension of the instant. So, yeah.
No, I think, no, I have nothing specific to say on death penalty. So I think to say, but they don't connect with my paper.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking papers. I have a first reaction that sort of follows on the remark that was made. I was reminded by your talk, David, about an incredible passage in Faust II by Goethe, where, in a way, Mephistopheles, whose occupation, if I may say so, is to collect deaths, and he claims to have a blood sign title to the soul of the dead. He's sort of desperate because he cannot distinguish anymore. He doesn't know if Faust is dead or not. And this is one of the first very intriguing occurrences to me of this zone of indistinction between life and death that disturbs a certain distribution, if I may say so, and that, in a way, death penalty is meant to reascertain. So that's a remark. I don't know how would you react to that. But then I had a question for you, Jacques. I don't want to to be to be seen as the usual Schmittian, which I'm not exactly. But since you gave us that amazing, wonderful detour through dictionaries, and especially through this Greek term epitedema, which is really a fascinating term and origin for the idea of occupation that you then developed until this sort of externalization of occupation in a public space that you so well described, I couldn't help thinking that one of the first Greek terms that comes to mind, if I were to translate the Latin verb occupare in Greek, I would choose nemein. And nemein, as you know, is the verb that could be nominalized as nomos. I mean, nomos is occupation, and Carl Schmitt demonstrated, or at least claimed, that the first meaning of nomos, before it means law, it means occupation in the sense of taking possession of. And then the second meaning of nomos that Schmitt recalls is distribution. Distribution, which is also one of your terms. So I hope that you will forgive this provocation, but I'm very curious to hear, what you think of this proximity.
I don't know, Peter, whether this sort of contract, the signing of his own life-death warrant, right, that Faust is involved in, I don't know whether that's a form of death penalty, right? But you're right. It certainly is suggestive of something like the way that the state technologically organizes the interruption of life, right? So there's probably something to be said there, and this is, there's a certain resonance that I would agree to, but I would want, I guess, to emphasize the specificity of the death penalty for our understanding of a number of things, beginning with the relation of the human to the technological, but also the operation of temporality of the human, as I was trying to examine a little here, and in the final analysis, the fact of an identifiable separation between life and death, right? An instant that one can ascribe that says on one side you're alive, on the other side you're dead, all of which the death penalty puts on stage, puts into operation, and makes it therefore the place, and here I'm following the suggestion of Derrida, to the place where one can look precisely to understand those concepts, to understand what life is, to understand how life is or is not opposed to death, and in what terms, and so on. So yeah, I take the resonance of your Goethe allusion.
First, I don't think that occupare could be translated by nemein, but probably a compound of ekain or ekastein, probably, but I don't remember. Doesn't matter. What matters, I've no problem, I've no problem with nemein, in this agreement precisely, I commented on the relation, precisely on the several meanings of nomos, the fact that nomos is, yes, a territorial distribution, that it is the rule, and also that it is, that it is also music, and so and this is how I try to precisely to construct what I call, the archipolitics, precisely, and precisely from Plato. So, well, so but at the same time, I think so. I have nothing, against the idea that there is some connection with Carl Schmitt, except precisely that it is not it's not an affair of war. It's not an affair of war. It's not an affair, of enemies and war and blood. No, Neyman really precisely refers to the relation between material division of spaces, and a symbolical configuration of the community, which, of course, is best illustrated by the famous, reform by Clisthène in Athens, precisely creating democracy. Well, we must go quickly. Creating democracy by redistributing, the space of the tribe, so as to constitute a kind of abstract egalitarian space, instead of the space, of course, of the space that was controlled, by the oligarchs. So, okay, no problem. Of course, this matter of space and this relation between space, rule, music, etc., is absolutely essential. So for me, simply, I think of it, regardless of any idea of war, things like this. If it is a war, I would say it's civil war. It is civil war about the meaning of a territory, and about how being in a place means precisely that you have this or that capacity, that you belong to the common in this or that manner.
Just a quick word. It was Schmitt also who in his late writings talked about la guerre civile mondiale, the worldwide civil war. So maybe that's also what occupation is about.
Maybe it was influenced by me.
Mark.
Okay. It's a question for David. I just wanted to ask whether you could just maybe, I very much enjoyed your paper. It's very rhetorically complex, and I was wondering if you could simplify for me your understanding of the political stakes of the figure of blood, or the concept, since that's our word today, the concept of blood, in an era in which it seems as though there has been historically a massive, as it were, disinvestment in that figure. I mean, I'm normally very suspicious of, our era being different from previous ones, but it does seem as though, in comparison to the massive history of, feudal and class systems, of chattel slavery, of forms of racism. You can always go to the National Socialism for the most dramatic deployment of some of these tropes. Compared to that, and compared to older forms of punishment and of warfare, we live in an era in which blood is has been rendered invisible, relatively invisible, which is, of course, as you were at pains to say, it's not to say that violence is in any less massive. But I guess I'm asking you to speak to that. I'll just stop there because otherwise I'd go on at no point.
Well, I guess to speak to your first point in terms of the political conceptuality of blood, I'm interested in the extent to which blood would supposedly not be conceptual, not be a concept, would be something literal, something unavoidably literal, and so on. And the extent to which it gets employed very quickly in all sorts of political rhetoric, for example, in which it becomes the very basis for a whole type of relation to the political conceived of in the most simplistic terms as, you know, the relation of the blood to the soil, the relation of the socius to soil, and so on. So I was interested to try and give that reminder through a certain reading of Schmidt that where blood is not very often visible, if you like. But then in the case of the more general question of blood's presence or absence, visibility or invisibility in the current scene, that's a vexed question. Obviously, you know, I think I could point to quite a few places around the globe today. It would not be very difficult, where we could quantify the blood and probably find that we had as much as we had in any other moments of history. But nevertheless, there are also instances where, particularly in the most technologically advanced West, we are able to act as though politics can be conducted without blood. And I made reference to that in terms of an international politics, but what I was most interested in is in terms of the political stakes of how that operates in the case of the death penalty. So that's how I'd answer your question.
May I just intervene for a second and say, isn't there a worry about the disappearance in this country, the concern about HIV, in the disappearance of blood and blood as death penalty, which would not be the case in other parts of the world, Southern Africa, for example? You know, just questioning the disappearance and what that would mean as a symptom.
Well, just to make clear, I'm not suggesting that blood has disappeared, but that it simply seems to play a different role now in power centers of the world and media distribution and military force and everything else than it would have 100 years ago. That's just a hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. When we fire a drone, we don't see the blood because there's nobody there, that is to say, on this side, who's filming it. But there are people who will show you the blood, right? We just don't see it on CNN and in the media. But it doesn't take place.
I'm not denying that for a moment. I hope it's clear I'm not.
No. I wasn't suggesting you did, but it's a very complex operation. There are attempts at invisibilization, certainly. Yeah, there is a presumption of invisibilization, to which the whole political body, if you like, in the U.S. and the political body in the widest sense seems to want to subscribe, right? So that if we don't have boots on the ground, we don't have blood because we don't have our soldiers killed, and so on and so forth. There's a whole logic operating there with extremely disturbing implications. Yeah.
Just a question for David. I see your talk to be more than just about death penalty. It's also commentary about political history of the West. And I was reminded of Foucault's sentence from Society Must Be Defended, where he says that our political history of the West is written in blood dried in code. And it's interesting that in these lectures where he actually speaks affirmatively about war, he does not connect blood to war, but to the code of representing the war. And so in that sense, I also see your presentation as a commentary about the whole conference here, in the sense that you really cannot talk about political concept without relating or bringing up front its relationship to blood. And in that sense, from what I witnessed today, this conference has offer us a plate of kosher concepts.
What concept?
Kosher, bloodless concepts. So my question is, where is the blood?
But then it's not a question for me. I gave you blood. I told you where. I showed it. I showed it to you. Yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent I was trying to write the political history of the West. I am certainly interested in the fact of how the death penalty functions historically, but in this specific historical moment. And, you know, we have to remember that in terms of the West, the US is the one country that practices it, so that it's very specific in that sense. And there's a lot to be said there. But that it is also a practice that's worldwide, and that we get examples of it daily, right? And spectacular examples. And bloody spectacular examples also. So those instances those comparisons would have to be made also. So I don't know that the question of the death penalty is just a history of the political history of the West. But certainly, in terms of the current politics of the West and the current politics of the US, for me, the death penalty is not just lethal injection within the borders of the US. It's necessarily the extrajudicial assassinations in drone warfare, and it's necessarily the fact of something like suicide bombing, where, of course, once again, you have a very strange temporality of crime and punishment. Punishment inflicted at the same moment as the crime. That takes place, yes, for the most part, we hope, outside of the political sphere of the West, but very much in conversation, in dialogue with Western political history.
Adi.
This is a question for Jacques, or a comment about the temporality of occupation. In the beginning, you said you're not talking about military occupation, but I think that an interesting way to relate the two meaning or two kinds of occupation is through contrasting the temporality of each. The occupation of a job or something that one does every day has a temporality of repetition. It is not supposed to end. It's something that is it's supposed to last for one's life. But it ends every day when one goes to sleep or whatever. The military occupation, but also the occupation of a lavatory room in the airplane, is supposed to be temporary. And it's temporary is not decided. You don't know when it's going to end. And this undecidability of something that is supposed to end but doesn't end is the very nature of this occupation in the airplane and on the ground. I mean, just think about what happens when the lavatory in the airplane is still occupied, and everybody is. And that's what we have in Palestine forever.
Well, I have not much to say, about the occupation of the lavatories, but I deliberately, focused, on a certain note, of signification around the word occupation as a specific political practice or practice trying to reinvent or to challenge, etc., the political, in our countries, by precisely changing the signification of a space. Well, in the case of Palestine, the problem is. Well, the problem, of course, it's an entirely different problem. It is the status of the relation, between the states or the non-states, today. It is the fact that precisely the boundary, between what is war and what is not war, has more or less vanished, which also means that, we also, it was perhaps a bit different, but I remember, that during the Algerian War in France, there was this slogan, la pacification n'est pas la guerre. Pacification is not war, And in a way, we have this kind of thing, occupation is not annexation. But occupation at the same time is precisely the process that makes occupation and annexation indiscernible, And I think that on this point, I agree with you, but which is precisely that now you have this kind of processes, but in this case it's a matter of states, it's a matter of states and states policy. Yes, those situations where it's impossible to say it's war, it's not war, it's annexation, it's not annexation, and it is true that an occupation can last eternally, precisely from the point of view that it is only an occupation.
Elizabeth next, and Suzanne.
This is for Jacques. At the very end, when you were saying that capitalism doesn't gather but scatter, and that the consensus, the drive to community and consensus was the politics that was exceeded politics. It seems to me that the drive to assemble in a community is the other side of the scattering, right?
Yeah.
So, but this is very depressing because then there's always an undoing of politics, right? And so I'm asking you what can be done. That's what I'm,
No. I shall not say what can be done, but it's true. But it's true yes, for me, it's a question, because on the one hand, I cannot agree with all those people who says, but they have no strategy, but this is always ephemeral, etc. But the problem is that those who have strategies have no strategy at the same time and do nothing. So that's not a problem. But at the same time, I was struck and I was struck by this kind of emphasis on the assembly as something really religious, and it was already the case. I think in Madrid, I was struck in Madrid by this kind of goodwill. We want to be together, we want to agree, etc., which is fine. But at the same time, of course, in the United States, it takes on, explicitly, religious overtones, and. Well, and at a moment, of course, I was not there, but I knew that there were those interventions, for instance, by Jody Dean, telling people, no, consensus is not good, you must be dissensual, And she was right, but at the same time, the point is that politics happens precisely in this kind of scattering, this kind of dispersion, which means that politics, goes along, or the attempt, to begin politics again, goes again with this kind of drive, for being in common, which at the same time, of course, is a kind of dismissal of politics. So this is the situation. I don't know whether it is depressing or not, but I think it's interesting. No, I was really struck because I try to work a bit more seriously, about Occupy Wall Street and all these implications, etc. Well, and the more I was studying it, the more I was disturbed precisely by this aspect of religiosity, of new life, really. And I think really, of course, in 68 in Paris, there is, of course, changer la vie, etc. But changer la vie at the same time was articulated with still a strong faith in class struggle and things like that, and still, but at the same time, but now I have the feeling, at a certain point, wanting to do politics is wanting to change life, but of course, it's hard to change life.
You may have already answered my question, but one thing that I was thinking about, it was very interesting how you want to use occupation in its very definition to also think about that as a way of occupying politics in a way that hadn't been done before. But there's another reading, and this is maybe exactly the sort of mirror opposite of Adi's question, where he's invoking the military occupation, what does one do with that, and the temporality of it. But on the other extreme, it seems to me that a lot of the occupiers or involved in this movement, or the theorists of it, are those who in fact are advocating increasingly the impolitical or the unpolitical, and these are particularly, people like Negri. And so they would actually take a very different spin on this, right? So that it's not occupying politics, but it's the belief that you're out of politics in some strange way, and that once you are in politics again, you are occupied. And so the only way of occupying is by, in fact, being out of it. Is that?
Yes. What I have, I've no real answer to this. The point is, what's interesting, in fact, yes, is that there is this sense of being out of politics, and at the same time, of course, a desire to recreate a political space, and but at the same time, you don't create a political space, by your design. So I think at the same time you have precisely the kind of formal landscape of the thing, but as if precisely the content, of the landscape, had vanished, because what happened in the of those movements, it could be perfectly be thought in old terms, or in all, Marxist terms, or in Negrist terms. You could of course, think of it in terms of, the multitude, the democracy of the multitude, etc., but precisely that did not happen,
Exactly.
Not simply,
That's why they're wrong.
Not simply because Tony Negri, is still prohibited to go to the States, but more radically, I think that this idea of this kind of collective consistency of the multitude, I think was absent,
Yeah.
We have a few minutes to collect a couple of questions, or the multitudes may be exhausted.
I have a question for David.
Use the mic.
There was a talk before about the tacit concept in each one's talk. There is the explicit concept and the tacit concept. So I think that your concept was either temporality or excess, or maybe trying to understand how excess of suffering is related to temporality. And blood was just, it seemed to me, it was just an entry into this problematic. So this is one thing. And then can we think quite speculatively and for this late hour of the day, can we speak about a transition, or not historical transition, but not historical, kind of a continuum between bloodless death or bloodless torture, which is very important in torture. It should be bloodless, and then tortureless prison, and then imprisonment-less exploitation and oppression, and then oppression-less exploitation till we come to high-tech society with its depression.
Bonnie, do you want to go ahead and then we'll try to see if we can collect?
Oh, okay, sure. Well, my question is for Jacques, and, oh, I'm so sorry. So it's a question for Jacques, or maybe just thinking together. I was hesitant to ask you this question because it could sound like I'm trying to defend Hannah Arendt, and I'm not particularly interested in defending. But I was thinking about how some of the things that you said about, you know, what it means to occupy a factory is that you have a place that's meant for work, and you occupy it, you divert it from its normal operations, and this is what's political about the occupation. So this understanding of occupation, which I like, presupposes the phenomenology that you criticized in Hannah Arendt, right? Which is that different activities bond us to different locations. This, if we take this to be not a normative claim, but a descriptive claim of the human condition, about the human condition, then it's the presupposition of the capacity to occupy and to be political. I concede that there are some places where she sounds like she's saying this in a more normative way, but there are many places where it seems to me she's saying this in a very descriptive way, which leaves us potentially with a kind of invitation to think about what happens when these get misappropriated or occupied. Sometimes something, as she would say, you know, something bad happens, like the rise of the social, which now we would call biopolitics, actually. But sometimes other possibilities emerge from this occupation of the proper location in an improper way. So that's one thing. And then relatedly, I just want to say, you know, so Zuccotti Park, which was the original site of occupation by Occupy Wall Street, this was, at the time I remember learning, that it was a privately owned public space. So this can make one long for the categories of Hannah Arendt, where at least you know where you are. Is it public, is it private, is it labor, is it work, you know? And suddenly you realize you're actually in this place where, you know, you can occupy this space because it's available. It's outside, but it's, you know, to go to your other categories, it's also owned. It's bounded, even though it seems boundless. So it scrambles the categories that you're working with in a way that doesn't disallow occupation, but makes everything we're trying to think about a little bit more difficult, by contrast with the maybe non-normative and merely phenomenological kind of account that Arendt gives, but which is now maybe no longer accurate.
Last collected question from Tim.
I like Adi's suggestion that the tacit concept in David's concept is temporality. I thought that possibly the tacit concept in Jacques' paper was maybe duration. And this is actually following on a little bit from Bonnie's question, because coming out of the Arendt notion of vita activa, each human activity points to a specific location in the world. There is a kind of perpetual spatialization of duration going on in a very particular rigid notion of occupation. And I wondered whether the kind of distribution of space that we see in the Occupy movement is actually an opening up of duration, of a kind of durée, in fact, within those occupied spaces.
We must, no, I thought it was over. No, just well, regarding Hannah Arendt, of course, I was really discussing the human condition. The human condition is rather, rather hard division, with this idea that really, there is the stage of public life, public excellence, and that really all other things, it's ugly, it's domestic, it's horrible, no, I think, really, of course, I don't know the whole of Hannah Arendt's work, but I think that, well, that really she's influenced not only by Heidegger, but also by this antique tradition, that really, you know, there are people that are made for politics, or there is a place for politics, and in order really to access the political place, you must get rid of your you know, private interests and needs, etc., etc. And my point has always been that, well, precisely what is at stake is to know, well, it's what happens when precisely there are people who try to transform a private affair into a public affair, and that this is precisely here that politics happens.
But there was nothing tacit about temporality in my paper from the first. Tacit was your word, wasn't it? Who am I going to accuse of tacit? From the first sentence to the last, I was concerned about nothing but time and temporality and the tense of the verb. So, but what I understood your suggestion more to be, or your question, was that I could have done without blood, right, in the argument. The way I'd answer that is to say that perhaps for the argument about temporality, one could do about blood, except one could do without blood, except that there is the fact, as soon as one looks at the death penalty, which was another subject of the paper, that that blood is a founding possibility. I think I would insist. Of the exercise of the death penalty, even if not all death penalties require blood, that the death penalty as a principle requires the idea of shed blood. So I would say that first of all. But that my other sense, I mean, here's my hypothesis. My other argument is that blood is the time of the human, that it's blood, the flow of blood, the flux of blood that gives the human time, gives time to the human. So, and that gets explicited, made explicit in the case of the death penalty. Vis-a-vis what you said in terms of extending the sense of the exsangue, the bloodless and so on, through a type of figurative drift, it's tempting and interesting. Yeah, I would hesitate to go too fast with that, but definitely there might be that sort of parallel to what is definitely a figurative contagion or drift that blood adopts, or that is exploited in the way that the blood gets increasingly figurative and necessary in political discourse. So maybe one could precisely go and look for your type of converse figurative drift also, but I haven't figured that out.
Thank you both, and thanks to everybody for your participation.